This is Joe Wong. Welcome to the Trap Set. During the age of social distancing, we're recording remotely and releasing daily episodes. Today's guest is Billy Martin. Though he's perhaps best known as the drummer of Medeski, Martin and Wood, Billy has sustained a 40-year career collaborating with several luminaries of experimental music, including Bob Moses, John Zorn, Iggy Pop, John Scofield, DJ Logic, and countless others. As we'll discuss, he's also a visual artist and educator. Billy spoke to me from New Jersey.
Hello.
Hey, Billy, how are you?
Good. How you doing, man?
Good. What are you up to?
I'm sitting here in my car and at a nature center in northern New Jersey, in the parking lot. Just did some shopping for my parents. My dad's 94, my mom's 87. So just took care of some food shopping for them.
You're a good son.
Try those nasty things I did. No, I'm a good kid in general.
Whenever I see a number coming in from a Hackensack, New Jersey prefix, it makes me think of Rudy Van Gelder and all those records.
Yeah. Well, and I live in Englewood, New Jersey, so that's where he ended up, recording a lot of famous stuff as well. And his studio is still there. I haven't been to Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey.
Right. Hackensack was where his parents lived, maybe, and that's where he started in their house?
Yeah, he did start there. One thing off the bat I'll tell you is that I'm not a jazz historian, and I'm not a historian in general, so I'm not going to be the best person to get facts from.
I'm only really interested in your personal history, so we'll try that.
Yeah, I'll try. I don't know. I'll try my best.
Well, we were talking about your parents, who luckily are both with us still.
Yeah, man, amazing.
What are some of your earliest memories of childhood?
I actually remember being in a carriage, being in a stroller in my courtyard of my building. This courtyard of this block we lived on, and it was on Seaman Avenue in right really in 200th Street and Broadway. That was the block, and Upper Manhattan. They call it Inwood. It's just north of Washington Heights. And I remember springtime, this time of year, when I just started, as a kid, I could feel the sun and see the sprouts in the the courtyard garden, and just having this overwhelming feeling of being in touch with nature or whatever it was. But yeah, that's my earliest memory of that. And then then there's a lot of other memories.
Were your parents musical people when you were growing up?
Always, yeah. My dad's a concert violinist. He was in the Beaux-Arts String Quartet. Speaking of jazz, one of the most famous records out there, Stan Getz Focus. And he was one of the 4 string players on that record. Incredible arrangements, Eddie Sauter arrangements. But yeah, and he also, Modern Jazz Quartet. He was on a lot of string sessions with them, but that was his brush with jazz. But he did a lot of really important music with the Beaux-Arts String Quartet, classical stuff, and was in the New York City Ballet, New York City Opera. My parents met at Radio City Music Hall. My dad was in the orchestra, and my mom was the dancer. My mom was a Rockette in the 50s, and that's where it all started. So yeah, definitely musical family.
What were you listening to in your house when you were growing up?
Well, what I remember the cool besides, my parents' records that were around when my brothers, didn't have their collection out when they weren't playing records was, Count Basie, the stuff I'm going to just mention mostly the stuff that my parents had that I remember getting inspired by, like Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and then classical music that my dad had. A lot of Russian composers because he was playing the City Ballet, and they used a lot of that, Stravinsky and Prokofiev and American composers like Copland and Carter and Gershwin. So my mom was into Basie and Ellington. That was like her stuff for dancing. She was into a lot of things. Some of it super corny stuff, but this was the cool stuff. Then there was
Wait, what
comedy
was the
records.
corny stuff?
They're sort of like generic dance records that is sort of like fake Dixieland and sort of like soft shoe, kind of like standards, almost like Muzak type of stuff.
Gotcha.
And then comedy records like what is it, the 100,000-Year-Old Man? That's with
Was that Mel Brooks?
Mel Brooks and oh my God, I'm blanking out. No, it's Reiner.
Oh,
Reiner.
yeah.
Yeah, Rob Reiner. Not Rob Reiner's the son. There's a Carl Reiner.
Carl Reiner,
Carl
his
Reiner.
father.
Yep. Yeah. And then Bill Cosby. Why is there air? And there's a picture of him with a basketball in his hand. And anyway, those were the records my parents had. Then my brothers, they had like
Were they older?
the Rolling. My brothers are older, yeah, like a decade older, like 8 and 10 years older. And they had Rolling Stones, Elton John, the Woodstock, live double. I think it was a double record. Sonny and Cher. I think that was my record, actually. I think when I was a kid, I wanted to have that one. I Got You, Babe, because I used to watch that show. Allman Brothers, James Brown. Did I say Sly and the Family Stone? Those records were laying around as I was, before I reached double digits. Then we moved to New Jersey.
What was the first instrument that you played?
The drums. My brother Kenny was the drummer in the family, and he sat me on the drums, crossed my right hand over my left, and taught me that beat that I play all the time. But yeah, that was the beginning, and that was when I could barely touch the pedals. And then it didn't happen for another 10 years. When we moved to New Jersey in 75, I was like 11, 12 years old. Then I unearthed his drums. But yeah, it was the drums. Yep.
Can you recall?
Oh, wait.
Oh, yeah.
Oh wait. So my dad did hand me the violin when I was 3 years old, which he did with every one of us. He, like, at a certain age, he would hand it over, and if you grabbed it and started playing it, that would be like the next step would be like, okay, let's make some sound. I pushed it away. But my mom put tap shoes on me when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and that was a thing that I kept going for till I was an adolescent.
Oh, really? Yeah, lots of the great drummers were tap dancers as well. I mean,
yeah, Buddy Rich,
Steve Gadd.
Yeah.
I think especially like the generation that Buddy Rich was raised in, the vaudevillian generation, when he was a kid, you were kind of expected to be a well-rounded entertainer and do several things. And at that point, drums were still like the drum kit was still kind of a novelty.
Sure, it's true.
But what am I saying? I'm not a historian either.
No, I think that's the right picture to paint. Vaudeville drums were novel. I mean, drums were just really invented in the early 1900s. So.
I mean, you might even say that they're kind of like an extension of tap dancing in some ways. Like lots of I think Like Joe Jones knew how to tap dance as well. Papa Joe
Yeah,
Jones.
yeah. Well, Roy Haynes and Jack DeJohnette. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember Jack DeJohnette got an NEA. He was an NEA recipient, and in Lincoln Center they were having in New York City they were having a celebration, and him and Roy Haynes did a little tap dancing thing I caught on video. They were just kind of like playing around in the lobby. And so yeah. I mean, coordinating yourself rhythmically with other sounds, like that was a huge influence for me. I didn't appreciate it until much later. That was like a building block for me.
And when you were 11, you unearthed your brother's drums in New Jersey.
Yeah. So 1975, we moved from New York City to New Jersey, and we had a basement. That was like, whoa, a basement under the ground of the house. And so was like, there was all the stuff that we had in storage. Like when you live in an apartment building, you have the carriage house. That's usually where you keep your, bicycles and extra stuff. And so I had never seen the drums, and since I had learned that beat from my brother, he took lessons for like, maybe a few months or something. And drums had disappeared. So like when we moved to New Jersey, there were the drums like piled up in the basement, and there was my dad's stereo. And I just set it up and started playing records and playing along, and was like, that led to, my dad finding me a teacher. Actually, my dad's friend, another violinist who knew this teacher that started it all.
Did you feel like you had an intuitive understanding of how the drums worked right away?
I wasn't even I couldn't even think for myself, like to even recognize that. It was just doing it. It was just like, I'm going to do what I do, what all kids do, is they make believe. They set up their little make believe world and they act like they're doing something, like I'm playing in a band. So how can I do that? Well, I guess I'll play a record and I'll be the drummer in the band and just figure out how to make it work. There was no going to the library or having a teacher at that time or looking it up. It was just remembering and watching, maybe seeing a drummer play on TV or something.
I started playing drums when I was 11 too, and I can
Wow.
remember a couple of instances where I experienced this completely new to me at the time feeling of ecstasy, like a deep feeling of joy in my body when I was playing. And it took me by surprise and kind of guided me to the path that I'm still on in music. And I wonder if you had any experiences like
Wow.
that early on.
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was just a sense of euphoria and like, transcendence of, escaping whatever reality I was in, and able to kind of had no friends at the time, because I was like uprooted from my neighborhood in New York City, and that was a whole community of kids on the block. It was always something to do, always someone playing on the sidewalk. And this was like, I'm in the suburbs, and it's like, it seemed boring and depressing and lonely, and now I didn't have any friends. So that really was like one of my escapes. Like, I'm going to get into this world and I'm going to play, and like and it was like sort of like it was a jolt of inspiration and joy and creativity, which I wasn't thinking like creativity at all. Although creativity was everything I was about as a kid. Drawing stuff and tap dancing and whatever, playing army and whatever else we do,
Yeah,
experimenting with
yeah. I was
stuff.
going to ask. You'd mentioned that you had this kind of inner make believe world. So aside from music, I know you're a visual artist. What other influences were pervasive in that world at the time?
Yeah, it's hard for me to remember. I mean, I just, there were things. I have to say that movies were a big influence, and it just as far as went to a lot of movies, or it was just a regular thing that we did, whether it was with my friends or it was with my dad, who would take us to he would take us to the Ziegfeld, which is like the movie house in, sort of Midtown Manhattan, where the best movie theater. He always went for the best, technically best experience of something when he could afford it. And I remember seeing Fantasia. I remember seeing James Bond, Diamonds Are Forever. I remember seeing, 2001 Space Odyssey, all like premieres. And those were hugely, influential in like my visual, sound life, story life. So I would say that was the first thing. It wasn't like the story of a lot of great artists that I admire, like Jean-Michel Basquiat's mom took him to the museum when he was a kid all the time. My mom didn't take me to a museum. I didn't experience a museum until I was really like 10 years old, and it was like a science museum. But there were things around. There was graffiti. There were people in the park who were like, drawing on pads. Some people were like, just, probably teenagers at the time. I didn't realize, and they would be getting into like, graffiti and drawing and like, designing things like in their pads and stuff. And I was just a little kid. I would experience a little bit of that and get inspired by that. My dad would have us sort of assembly line, kind of like, give us colored markers, and we celebrated Christmas, even though I'm like half Jewish, but like he's Jewish, but he's not practicing it. But like we would celebrate Christmas, and we would draw the Christmas tree with with the decorations, and it would be like an assembly line thing. Give us index cards and a bunch of magic markers, and I really loved that. And then my brothers would draw pictures of like horror scenes where it was like a corridor with like cracked walls and spiders, and it would sort of be like a 3D kind of like corridor. And I remember like learning how to do that, and stick figures with like knives and heads cut off and bloody things. And I was into that, and they would get into that, so I would like watch them and copy them, and that stuck with me. That was like, that kind of drawing to escape and kind of really get a feeling from it, when you do that.
Earlier, you mentioned that your dad helped you find a drum teacher early on.
Yeah, yep.
What was that person's name, and how was that relationship?
Okay, so the drummer was Alan Herman, and my dad basically, we were in our new house. My dad's one of his best friends was like another violinist who was visiting, and I was down in the basement playing, and then his friend asked me, he said, "Do you want to like take lessons, to drum lessons?" And I was like, "I don't know." And he was like, "'Cause I know a really great guy, and he doesn't normally teach kids beginners." He said, "But we're close, and like I think I could get him to teach you to play a little bit." And so we did it, and that was Alan Herman. And Alan Herman, was really a rock drummer who studied at Juilliard, so he knew the classical, he could read, and he did. He was one of the early drummers on Broadway that did he's on a chorus line. He Jesus Christ Superstar. He toured with Rita Moreno and Liza Minnelli, and then he worked with Bob Fosse. And so, but he really taught me for 2 years, I was really strictly working on my stick control on my hands and learning how to bounce the stick and like systematically, create a really good technique of effortless playing. And that was a huge foundation that he set up for me. And I was just a good student. I just did what he told me to do. And he told me, like, when you're home, you can play the drums, do a drum set, whatever you want to do, but I just want you to focus on this page, these, that. And it was like the first time that I started to, learn something for real. Like, school wasn't my thing. I was not good in academically, not good in school. And Alan Herman, so that was Alan Herman,
Yeah, lots of the people that I've spoken to on this show experience difficulty with that type of lessons early on. Like they didn't have the patience for it, or they just wanted to express themselves musically and couldn't be bothered to learn how to read that early on. What is it about your relationship with Alan that you think made you kind of take to the curriculum?
Well, I think it was really about his treating me with the utmost respect and on equal, on equal footing. Like he was very like caring, and the first thing and blew my mind the first lesson, because I thought I got to go in there and I got to be able to like hold the sticks and like I'm gonna start like getting into like academics again, of what it is. And he was like he started bouncing a ball on the floor, like just dropping it, and like I was just. And the other thing is like where he lived. He lived in Alphabet City. He lived on Avenue C in like 10th Street.
So you
In
would
the
take the train into the city?
No. My dad would drive me. He drove me every Wednesday. He would drive me, drop me off, sleep in the car, take a nap, and I would go up into the building and come back. And that was like for a
This is
year
the
at
mid
least.
70s when Alphabet City was rife with like, drugs, and it's not the
Yeah,
same Alphabet City that is there today.
Yeah, I mean, my neighborhood that I lived in Inwood, 200th Street, was also like, I mean, it was like it was 60s into the 70s. It was like heroin, stepping over junkies in your building. So it was like, it didn't phase us, but like when people hear that I was down there, they're like astonished, like that, that my dad would even go down there. But we were just kind of like, we grew up in the city. So, but it was dangerous. And the funny thing is that, like, when I got up to Alan's apartment, it was like a really big, lofty kind of apartment. And there was a hole in his floor, and you could see into the other apartment downstairs. And there are a lot of other things about it. Like, he was dating this dancer. She was this African American woman. She was like a Broadway dancer. And I was just like, it was like, whoa, this whole other world. Like, and so I was very impressed by like his lifestyle. It was like a bohemian lifestyle, and he was very independent, and he was very like respectful to me, and just the way he taught me. And he blew my mind with this concept of bouncing the ball on the floor, really just teaching me physics and just saying, look, your ball's like is like the stick, except that your pad may be the rubber and the floor is the wood, the stick is wood. He said, but basically it's the same concept. You drop the stick and you let it bounce. Don't drop this. Just you have to hold the stick loosely, but it's really just like bouncing a basketball or anything else, and that's all you have to do. You should never work hard to make a sound. Like, it should just be effortless. And this is where we're going to start. And then he pulled the book out, taught me eighth notes, 16th notes, triplets, with stick control, that book called Stick Control, which was his Bible, really. It was like, that was like, he still works, teaches out of that. Also, he's a Joe Morello student, and that's another story, but later I studied with Joe, but like, that's a lot of it stuff he studied with Joe, so I got a lot of that.
You studied with him for a couple years, and then that brought you into your teen years. And what was your state of mind then? Like, was drumming central to your identity at that point, or was it still kind of a hobby?
Well, it was both, because I didn't know, like, really if I wanted to be a musician. I was still, I was really into Jacques Cousteau and John Denver as personalities, as people who were like about the environment, about like, the wilderness. And that was a huge thing for me, because I grew up in the concrete jungle, man. I grew up in the city. So like, I didn't like that whole idea of the wilderness society and Jacques Cousteau going underwater and going to these exotic places, and John Denver singing in the mountains, and and like having a relationship with Jacques Cousteau, like like singing about Jacques Cousteau's boat, the Calypso. And as a kid, it was just like, oh my God, I want to work for Jacques Cousteau. Like, I want to be one of his. I was very much into boats in the ocean, because I had, my mom's side is from Boston, and my cousins and my uncle were captains on boats, and they'd take people fishing, and they would lobstermen and all that stuff. And I worked for them late in my teen years. So I was still like, am I going to be an oceanographer, marine biologist? Or am I going to do this drumming thing? So it was kind of like, the drumming thing to me was like, holy shit, this is amazing. I'm learning a lot, and like, yeah, I think I'm kind of good at it. So then yeah, so now I'm 13, going into freshman year of high school, and that's where I start a band and stuff. So with like a trio, like a power rock trio, and
What
that
was the
so
band
like
called?
it was just the Dave Fields band. It was this really talented guitarist who lived in another town. We went to the same high school, and he was like just really competent. He could play anything. He could play anything that was written, or anything, any style, like from George Benson to Van Halen. Like he had a really incredible technical ability to do that. He wasn't an improviser. He wasn't a good improviser. He could play solos, but they're usually solos all from listening, learning. So everything we did was like a top 40 band. But we still had a connection. We still had a chemistry. And let me tell you something else that was interesting. I don't tell too many people about this. But like his sister, Lana, was deaf, and she played the bass. So the first like period of like just playing in my room, they came over. I'm playing with a deaf bass player and this guitarist, and they were both very good musicians. And like we had a really good thing going. And so that built for a couple of years. And that sort of led me in the direction of like continuing on and starting to get the positive feedback from my friends, from people in school, playing parties, and and that relationship lasted till sort of almost the end of high school, and then as well as joining the concert band, the jazz band, marching band, and then I went in my own direction. Then I went into a whole other thing.
How would you characterize that whole other thing?
Whole other thing meaning developing as an artist, as an individual voice, as someone who's I'm not just going to play like Steve Gadd, or I'm not going to play like, I'm not going to play, I'm not going to just act like I'm some other drummer. I'm actually going to find my voice. And the only way I could do that is by playing every possible gig with a variety of different people. I didn't have it planned that way. But it was sort of a release from like, I can only play in this band when I'm in high school. This is the only people I know. And then there's the concert band and the school stuff. But I got tired of playing in this one band because I was frustrated, like I was frustrated because I wasn't as good as the drummers that I was copying. And that's kind of what was required in this band. It's like, play like Steve Gadd, play like John Bonham, and believe me, I played a lot of stuff on my own. I played along to a lot of Zeppelin, Aerosmith, and the Police.
Oh, did I lose you? Oh, I'm
No,
sorry, I
hello.
lost you there for a
Yeah.
second, Billy.
Oh,
You were
okay.
saying
Where
the
did you?
Police.
Yeah. So the Police, Stuart Copeland, John Bonham. I was playing along to those records and getting a lot out of that. I call it a vocabulary. When you learn, vocabulary of how other people play, it becomes like something you can use later.
Right. And then at a certain point, you have to take that vocabulary and make your own statement. And that's kind of what you're talking about as your next step.
Yeah, it's like any I'm 17 I graduated when I was 17. I was like any teenager, early 20s. You're just trying to figure out who you are. So I had to kind of get out of that situation. It was frustrating, playing in a band that was just playing top 40 tunes and trying to play them exactly the way they are on the record. Like, that was not satisfying to me after a while. And I didn't know what else, but I just, that led me to, discovering Brazilian music and studying with a lot of different teachers along the way. So during this whole high school period, after Alan, I ended up studying with a lot of drum teachers, like different ones privately, and percussion teachers. And that was Chuck Spees. He was a guy that played at Radio City. That's how my parents knew him, through that scene. He was a Broadway drummer. He was playing Chicago, that show called the original Chicago, Bob Fosse. And he was really a ragtime drummer too. And then there was Sonny Igo. Sonny had played with Woody Herman and Tommy Dorsey. So he was like the old school, certain type of big band playing, and you might know his son Tommy Igo. And then there was Paul Price, who was basically the first percussion music director for percussion ensembles, who worked and conducted and promoted percussion ensembles, and worked with John Cage and a lot of other people. My dad knew him from orchestral percussion and stuff. And I really wanted to play orchestral music as well. So that was like breaking out of the top 40 band and getting into the symphonic, chamber music world that my dad exposed me to, and I was able to sit in on his sessions. He would do movies with Ennio Morricone, and that was the highlight of like, holy, watching my dad play, under the direction of Ennio Morricone, and watching him do other recordings, for commercials, and sitting and watching the drummer. There's this drummer Ronnie Zito. He was a big session guy that played a lot of that stuff. I used to sit in the drum booth when he would let me, and then I used to sit in the middle of the orchestra when my dad played New York City ballet rehearsals, movie scores. All that was a huge influence, and then I started to think, well, I want to also get into that. So that's really different than the top 40 rock thing or the big band jazz thing that I learned in school. So everything started to open up,
When you studied with all of these teachers, did you have specific goals that you were asking for their help on, or was it just a general thing to kind of broaden your influences?
No, I just did what they told me. I just I didn't have a choice. Like, I didn't know what drum teacher after Alan Herman. I didn't know where to go, and my parents found Chuck Spees because his wife was Rockette with my mom, and my dad was in the orchestra with Chuck.
Right.
It was like an obvious choice. And he lived in Englewood, and we lived 5 miles away. And then Sonny Igo was, I'm not sure how I found Sonny, but Sonny was like in another town 10 minutes away. And Paul Price was in Teaneck. He was 10 minutes away, and my dad found, I don't know how Sonny Igo came into the picture, but my dad had something to do with Paul Price and Chuck Spees. And I used to go into the city and study. I studied with Alan Herman in the city as well, like taking the bus into Times Square sometimes. There was Professional Percussion Center or shop, and that was on 46th Street. Very famous block of music stores and drum studios. And I also studied with Sonny Igo there. And, so there were private lessons going on, and I didn't come to them and said, I really want to learn about this. I was just like, they told me what to do. Paul Price, I knew that I wanted to learn about, I wanted to be a symphonic percussionist. So he was going to show me. And what I learned from Paul was much more than that, because I never was fully formed as a symphonic percussionist, because I really am not a good reader. I'm not a good sight reader. And learning all the scales on the vibraphone and marimba and stuff like that was like it just I was just not, I didn't have the capacity at the time to deal with that. But he still had me playing, doing these things. At a certain point, he said, "You know what, you should write. You should try writing, composing." And then I ended up writing something. He ended up premiering it in a college with a college percussion ensemble.
That's such an evolved stance as a teacher, because lots of people would just insist that you learn the mechanics before you're qualified to compose something, whereas he was just trying to help you by any means necessary.
Yes, and that was the message I got from him. Okay, so like imagine that he's working with John Cage, but he's also doing, Edgar Varèse's ionization, which is like extremely complex, sort of, all kinds of very difficult time signatures and very strange instruments, but and other repertoire that's mostly reading, not improvising. I think he saw something in me that had that capacity to kind of like figure out a way just by just giving me the opportunity to do something. So I just ended up doing something pretty straight. I just kind of like wrote a piece for 5 snare drums called Variations on Bolero, and it was literally the bolero, from Ravel's Bolero, that riff, and just kind of like developing, creating like a canon of staggered snare drum riffs and shaping it into something. And I know it wasn't very good, for my taste, but I think that he really did it. I mean, I went to rehearsals with him, and I was not in college either. I was just I think I was my senior year in high school or just out of high school, and no, it had to be I don't know. I have to find that out when it was exactly, but it was still like, to me, unprecedented. I just thought I could never be a composer, like I just want to be in an orchestra and play composers' work. And he gave me this opportunity, and it was just like Alan Herman. It was like blew my mind that you can do this, and like I have another story about Alan Herman that happened just around that time, right, exactly around that time. So Paul Price said you should write some music. I think you'd be good at writing. And maybe he was just like, this kid's never going to be able to, sight read very fast. So like, let him be a creator, you know. And I really got that message from him that was like, man, you can be like an artist. And that was huge. And so then I get a call. I pick up a call from Alan Herman, who had been really missing in action for the past 4 or 5 years. And he calls up to ask my dad to get some tickets to the City Ballet. He wanted to go to the City Ballet. And then he said, hey, what are you doing? I'm like, hey, what are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm doing this Broadway show, Bob Fosse's Dancing, and it's a cool show. Why don't you come down? Why don't you sit in the pit and check it out? And I took his offer. I sat in the pit with him, and I was blown away by like the variety of music. They did Ionization by Varese. They did Mr. Bojangles. They did Sing Sing Sing. They did all this. They had 2 percussionists, and he was the drummer. And if you know anything about Bob Fosse, he's one of the great genius artists of our time, choreographer and film director. So I was blown away. After the show, Alan said, so you want to be my sub? You want to do the show? And I was like, I said, I could never, that would take me forever. I said, that would take me 10 years. He said, well, if we're still around in 10 years, then you'll get your chance to do it. But here's the book. And you just take it a little at a time and come back and let me know where you're at. And, he said, come back, bring your Walkman, record the thing. Here's the charts. And then listen, play along, learn these charts. And I did it, man. I just did it. And a month later, I was subbing for him on Broadway. I was playing that show. It's crazy. And I played on stage, Sing, Sing, Sing. You have to memorize everything on stage. So it's the Sing, 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 Benny Goodman with Gene Krupa drum solo. Everything is written around that piece, and the drum solo in particular, where the dancers move and bump, and you have to be up on a 12-foot riser, memorized, all the stuff. I'm 17 years old, scared shitless, but I did it, and it was incredible. The drums were nailed to the platform because it would rock, sway back and forth a little bit, and so you didn't want the drums falling off the thing onto someone's head. So I couldn't even adjust the goddamn drums. I had to just deal with like where they were, or a bigger guy, or Alan had a very interesting way of setup. Anyway, that could you imagine like in that kind of like that kind of license
Yeah, it must have been
from
really empowering.
It was incredible. It was incredibly scary. I can't believe I did it. I think I was kind of naive. I was just like, and you know how like we all get delusional, and sometimes it's good to be a little
I think
delusional
so,
because then,
especially when you're
then
playing music.
yeah, you have to kind of like imagine, yeah, you could be good, or you could be great, or you could be in this situation, but it could also be, you could also be totally unrealistic. But I was given these opportunities. I took advantage of them. I learned so much. It gave me so much encouragement. You know.
Yeah, to your point, I feel like, in my experience, I've it's a balancing act between embracing that kind of naivete and going for it, and then also listening to my self-critical mind once in a while, and finding the right balance between those two traits.
Oh yeah, it's a balance. Every life is a balance. The whole thing.
So a few years later, you started appearing on records with Bob Moses. How did that come about?
So that was another turning point in my life. So after all this stuff went down, writing a percussion ensemble and playing on Broadway with Bob Fosse show as a sub, I was discovered Brazilian music, and well, I discovered it. I didn't know what the hell it was. I didn't know what a samba was. So it was one of these sessions where I was like supposed to play a samba, and I was being basically like told like that's not a samba. This is how blah blah blah, and I couldn't do it, and I was embarrassed, and I was like, okay, looking in the Village Voice, just had nothing to do with like research for a samba. It was just it happened to be in the back page. I saw samba classes at the Drummers Collective, and I'm like, well, that sounds like I need to go there because it says samba classes and it's a Drummers Collective. What's that? I'm going. I went. I went there. It was on 42nd Street at the time. I remember going up the elevator and just hearing, all of the Batucada samba stuff. That it's like sack tack doom a go-go bells, squeakers, shakers, and watching all these people, these multi-culti, group of people playing in a circle, and this guy's blowing a whistle, and they're making these calls, and I was choked up. I was so choked up, I wanted to cry because it was so beautiful, and it was so something that I realized this is musical drumming. This is so deep. So I ended up taking that class whenever it happened, and then the Drummers Collective moved down to 6th Avenue, 14th Street area, and then that's where I met Moses because he started coming to the class. He had just gotten back from a trip to Brazil, to South America, and was deeply inspired by meeting Hermeto Pascoal, genius composer, in Rio, who was living in Rio at the time, and he wanted to incorporate all that sound, and he went to this samba class, and there I was, and he saw that I was like this gringo that really had a handle on this stuff, and he was young and influential, and he said, "Hey, you want to come over? I live in Brooklyn, and I'm working out this stuff. I'm composing some things, and I need someone to kind of like hold down some of these parts for me while I." You want to come over? And I said, sure, and then later I asked the people in the class, who's this Bob Moses guy? And they were like, are you kidding me? He's a legend. Like, played with Jocko and Pat Metheny and Gary Burton and Gil Evans. And I was like, all right, cool. I know some of those people. And I went to his brownstone. He lived in an apartment in brownstone in Brooklyn and Park Slope at the time. And it was just an incredible experience. He was so much fun, and he had so many great stories, and it was just like the beginning of a mentorship that wasn't officially called a mentorship. He took me under his wing, and from that point on, I was his Padawan. I was his, his apprentice, and he included me in everything. He even took me on the road to Europe. We did a percussion trio tour through Europe together when I was very young. And we recorded a duet record called Drumming Birds together in my dad's basement. because my dad had all the recording gear. He loved my dad. My dad loved him. So it was like this great kind of admiration. And then he moved to Boston, and like he just called me up whenever he had a gig, and he needed a percussionist. Yeah, so that's where I was turned on to the real artists who had, they just put their own individual voice into the compositions that Moses would write and direct them through. And I watched him work with Bill Frisell, with Dave Sanborn, with Danny Gottlieb, with Nana Vasconcelos, with Pat Metheny, Lyle Mays, with Eddie Gomez, with Dave Liebman, and I played with all these people as this little young percussionist dude, and had watched them work and was with them. And I did other things too. I was like his co-producer. I was like his assistant. I would set up his drums, and I would take notes and play parts when he needed them. And it was just like, I couldn't ask for a better education and a better portal into artists, individual artists,
Was it
watching them.
was it an ambition of yours to develop a singular voice like the artists you mentioned?
No, not at all. I didn't know. I wasn't aware of, to me, this was like, oh, this is what jazz is now. Like, it's like they're like combining, it's like a multiple vocabulary, multiculti, or, influenced many styles coming through this music, and it was like Bill Frisell sometimes sound like, he's playing some, rock chords, but then he's got this fluidity and then he can play these beautiful jazz melodies, and it was all sort of like, wow, this is possible. You don't have to just be one thing. You can
Right.
kind of,
And at this point, which was the early to mid 80s, previous iterations or periods of jazz were being kind of codified into this liturgical thing in academia. So, like bebop was now like almost like a religion. It was being represented a certain way, and it was like studying Latin or something. Whereas what you're talking about is more of like the spiritual successor to what that music meant in the context of its own time.
yes, I couldn't put it better. That's basically it. And so that was another thing about meeting Moses, because he was like, he didn't want to hear anybody say the word jazz. He's like, I can't stand jazz. I can't stand the way it's being represented now. We're not playing jazz. And he was like, these people in the suits with a conservative kind of thing they're doing. He says, I hate it. He said, it's the opposite of why I play music. So I don't want to have anything to do with it. I want to play reggae. I want to play. He was starting to get into a lot of rhythmic based stuff, So that's why the Brazilian stuff was the perfect kind of like, medium for him to play with. Like, he can write like Gil Evans and have a Brazilian samba, bossa nova under it, and I turned him on to like hip hop stuff and all kinds of things that I was listening to at the time. That was like, he just loved funk and all that. And so it was like all of these things he was into incorporating. And I didn't realize it, this was the 80s. This was the early 80s. And there was a lot of, melding, a melting pot of musical styles going on, world music, and the Creative Music Studio, where I'm now executive director of, was a big part of that, up in Woodstock, where Don Cherry and Carl Berger and Ola Tunji and Pat Metheny and Jack DeJohnette and Carla Bley, they were all up there. Anthony Braxton, Eddie Blackwell were up there a lot, and they were working. Moses was living up there at the time. So like, I didn't even realize it, but that's what was happening. And that opened up my world. Moses was very much into like a lot of different Pan-African music, meaning like, it could be the Caribbean, it could be West African soukous, it could be, Fela. It could be, Brazilian samba, Haitian voodoo, Afro-Cuban stuff. So there was like all of that. I was being like, just the gates were opening, but then there was this sort of these younger musicians that he was. I guess he was in his 30s, 40s then, 30s, and I was 19. I don't know, and it was like these guys had grew up, listening to Coltrane and going to those gigs, and those little clubs in the city and Ornette and watching things change, from the old, more conservative jazz. So he was like, at the time, he was like, man, I don't want to hear that word jazz. I'm very upset about this whole thing that's happening. I was very conservative. I'm suits. Are you kidding me? Like, jazz is like freedom, man. Of course, we understood the whole suit thing and certain kind of trying to get a respect, certain. And but he was basically like, he just didn't want to replay history. He wanted to like, he's an artist. So that was my firsthand experience watching him and other people just reinvent, jazz, keep it alive, grow some new branches.
Um, at this point, was there still any interest in marine biology?
Always. I mean, I'm still interested in oceanography, anything that has to do with underwater life. But yeah, it was there. I think it was there more visually and more as just like another world that I could get into. That was just like another dimension, in a way, transcend, my musical career. But no, as far as a career goes, no. I knew. Basically, it was my junior year in high school is when I knew, like, I think, music is my thing. I'm going for music. And that had to do with also with chamber music and having this experience of not just being a rock band, but also playing in a big jazz band and also like conducting a little bit of the ensemble and like what's it like to be a conductor. And I had some really interesting opportunities and also the artist. So my junior year was also being exposed to my humanities teacher, English humanities teacher, turning me on to Cubism and Duchamp and Zen and Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel films, and just having my mind blown with like a whole other world that I didn't know existed of expression of art, visual, philosophy, and I was like, I want to be in music. I want to be I want to be whatever it is. I just want to do it all. I want to explore all the musical avenues, particularly. At the time, it was particularly classical and maybe big band jazz, And then after that, like I said, the Brazilian scene took me into that world of Brazilian music and studying Afro-Cuban music, and then meeting Bob Moses, and then being exposed to the artists who were using it all. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just the Brazilian scene. It wasn't just the Afro-Cuban scene. It wasn't just jazz. It wasn't just rock. It was like everything was being encompassed into the music. And that was Bob Moses and all those people I mentioned.
Is there a line between respectfully drawing inspiration from music from around the world and cultural appropriation? And if so, where would you draw that line?
Yeah, well, I've always had a problem. I've always run into problems with that. And particularly, it started. I noticed that I was getting a little bit of a flack from having a little bit too much of a good time playing in a Brazilian group with another gringo partner who was like, "You're not playing." He would accuse me of not playing the tradition in a traditional way, and I was kind of improvising. I was the snare drummer, and the snare. Basically, you learn the language. There's a certain structure to Brazilian samba where it's like the clave in Afro-Cuban music. It's sort of like you can't turn it around. It's based. It has a clave, and it has all these parts. The alto, partito alto, all these different parts. Like it's almost like 4-part harmony, in rhythmically. But I was able to. I knew all of that. I had already mastered all of that. I was teaching the class at the time. I was a sub, and so I was able to improvise. Over with the snare drum parts. And this one dude pulled me aside, or really called me out in front of the whole ensemble. It was just like, man, you're not playing. You don't have respect for the tradition. This guy was not Brazilian, but he was calling me out, saying like, and I was and my teacher was like, no, that's what we do. That's like we improv. This tradition has an improvisation thing. As long as you understand the basic structure, it's evolving all the time. And that was a good thing for me to experience. And I just thought that like that kind of set me up for like how I'm going to go forward. I'm like, I don't want to be stuck playing traditional music. I don't want to be in a place where the rules are so strict that I can't break out of this repeating history situation. So,
Right. There's this notion of like static authenticity that I feel is not helpful. I mean, if you look at any culture in the world, especially in this era, cultures are fluid. Cultures are always responding to one another. Even the notion of like a culture to begin with, like that it's a discrete thing that can be quantified, is a little bit ridiculous. And so I hear what you're saying. You don't want to be tethered to what somebody was doing years ago just for the sake of tradition.
absolutely. And I look at it this way: there's either either the music and the culture is alive or it's dead. So it's like looking back and sort of like reliving that period for educational purposes or for ritual purposes or for whatever it might be. That's fine.
I mean, think about any other like spoken language, like English, for example. We are not speaking in the same version of English that people spoke in the 40s when bebop was a musical form. And we're certainly not speaking in Shakespearean English, but it doesn't mean that, the ideas being communicated are any less important. And it also doesn't mean that we can't study that stuff and have it inform the way that we communicate. But to speak in Shakespearean English, in a regular conversation would come off as pretty pretentious.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, true. I think it's all about evolution. I'm about evolving. I'm about the improvisational. Look, I'm an experimental artist. That's it. My friend John Zorn, who's a good friend, like a mentor of mine, we sit at lunch as we often do. And he said, look, we're experimental artists. We're not jazz. We're not classical. We're not punk. We're not, we're all of that. We experiment. So let's get out of the genre thing. I'm this, I'm that. We're experimental artists.
I mean, is there any other kind of artist, really? Is there a non-experimental artist?
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Well, the only problem I have with this word experimental is that I think the younger folks are starting to trying to quantify it and trying to understand that some people think that means electronic music or it means avant-garde, or what does that mean? Avant-garde to me was the experimental. To me, avant-garde and experimental are kind of the same, but I like experimental better because it's just so generic. Yet it's
Well, I
so
also
yeah.
I also
No,
like that
artists are true
notion that
artists.
every time you sit down to play, you're kind of experimenting. Like you're not sure what the outcome is going to be. There isn't a set destination.
Well, that's how I am. That's how I am most of the time. That's how I develop my vocabulary and keep evolving.
It also means that you have to be willing to fail and you have to embrace a certain amount of vulnerability, because if it's an experiment, it could blow up in your face, and you have to be willing for it to blow up in your face in order to get wherever you want to go.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And there has to be some humility. There has to be sort of like, not take yourself so seriously to be able to exist this way. And you learn the hard way. Some people learn the hard way. Some people have an easier time with it. I wrote about this in a book I wrote called Wandering, with like 22 chapters, but they're dealing with different aspects of just being who I am. But I've learned so much in the failing and the sort of experimenting, going down the wrong path. All those things to me are what it's about when you're just playing, improvising, alone or with other people in the room. That you're not gonna be perfect, and you're not gonna achieve greatness all the time, and you just got to be able to let that go and keep moving forward. And the more you do it, the more it becomes a sincere and valuable gift, of giving of yourself for the better, to grow and inspire other people to do it. And this goes beyond music. This goes into how we live our lives and with the situation we're right now. We have to be creative, and we have to be able to figure out how we can get around certain problems, from very simple things to complex things. You need to be able to improvise, experiment. That's what a scientist does. That's what I tell my students. I'm like, just think about a scientist who's combining two different elements together, and they're kind of just, it's there are many times they may try this to get somewhere, but it could blow up in their face. But that's what you're doing with rhythm and with sound, and with composing. And don't expect it to be great the first time. You know?
What do you think about the most throughout the day?
Uh, well, that's a good question. I don't. I try to not think. First of all, I try to just be. I just try to be in the moment and take it in. So I think I'm trying to observe more and respond to things that come to me. So that's a creative process in a sense. It's also a way of learning. That's I use that. Listening is probably the most important thing about being a musician. So, but you don't have to be a musician. Listen can be a metaphor for just observe the situation before filling it up with your ideas, and then kind of respond to it. But you have to really give it a good amount of attention. So I guess I try to be as observant without getting in the way too much, and then respond. But it's not like a calculated thing. It's just really not thinking. I think if there's anything it's not thinking is, and I don't mean that in like, oh yeah, just don't think and just, don't learn. But I mean, the initial thing is like not to try too hard, just to kind of like, there's plenty of information around you. You have to sort of give it space and pick out the things that are really going to move you and use them and react to them.
Have you
I
always
think
been that
that's what
way?
no, no, I've always been like, I got this idea, I'm going to pursue it. The delusion of like, this is what I want to do, is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try, fill up the space,
Right.
always busy. I'm always busy still. That's always the way I'm definitely the multitask kind of person. I like having more than one thing going on at a time. Sort of another sense of harmony, rhythmic harmony, counterpoint. It's like, I like visual art. I like to play drums. I like to compose. I like to, observe nature, people. I like to. I like the education process. I like. I like the edu. I like. I like. I'm into education as a creative process.
Right. But I want to kind of touch back on something that you said, that you haven't always been this way, and so you used to want to be busy for the sake of kind of like exerting your will on the world or making things happen, and it seems like now you're approaching it from a more egoless perspective.
True. Yeah. So I would say when I was younger, I was always trying to prove myself. I wanted to be part of something. So I was always trying real hard to, you know, to be part of the world and not really observing deeply, or listening as much. A lot of
Yeah,
ideas, a lot of, go ahead.
it's almost like you didn't remember that you already were part of the world.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sure. Yeah, I mean this is the intellectual mind, doing its thing and trying to make sense of things and trying to be part of in a way. And also an
Ultimately trying to
underdeveloped.
survive, right? Like that's where it probably on a lizard brain level comes from, is like we see ourselves as a living entity, and our job is to stay alive. And then it extends, like in art, to like trying to exert your vision onto the world around you. And what it sounds like, you've gotten to a place where it's almost like if you're in a band, now you're listening to everybody else and not even really noticing what you're doing anymore. Whereas before you were, trying to be clever, and your parts were the most important to you, or that's where the focus was.
Yeah, there was a separation. That's a separation, like, yeah, focused on what I'm doing and not really as a whole, as a communal whole, or as the bigger picture, that we are all connected, and then all we wanted to be is loved, and that we just want to be part of we want to be accepted for who we are, you know, and also just to figure out, who am I? Like, how do I want to be? Do I want to be? Do I like this?
Right.
Separated, alone, but feeling the universal connection to everything, or do I want to be involved all the time with people, engaged socially all the time? They're both okay. It's just about accepting who you are and just being like, it's okay. And then, but I think deep down, everybody just wants to be loved and accepted, and feel okay. And ultimately that means I just want to feel happiness, just feel
Hmm.
good about my place. And there's the most important thing that I think I tell people who are developing or searching or pushing and trying so hard, is that it doesn't matter like how much you contribute. It's just that you contribute something to the world that is you, not
Yes.
someone else. It's you, and it can be small little thing. It can have a profound effect on one person, or multiple people, or you could have multiple discoveries and share that. It's like, don't be caught up in the quantity of how much you contribute to the world, but at least you are true to yourself and true to the world. What you're unique. Work on that.
Yeah, and like you said, it's almost like beyond our control, to a certain extent. Like we're a product of our genetics and our environment, and plenty of experiences over which we had no control. And but on the other hand, I mean, that's really all we have to offer, is that unique combination of things, like parsing through that and putting something out into the world of our own.
Yeah, yeah, it's just, yeah, exactly. We're all wired differently, whether it's like, the DNA and all just that stuff that just comes built in. Uh, and then there's the shaping of the person, and I always look at it as coming more from the heart and less from the intellectual thought, like to feel your way, you know to feel your way in the music, as opposed to think your way in the music,
Hmm.
you know. And I think that I've learned so much, beginning really mostly with Bob, from Bob Moses on, about that process of being an artist, and being more feeling your way, as opposed to having your clever ideas, forced on yourself and others, but to kind of then find the balance, You do, things come to you. You're a visionary, right? Everybody can be a visionary. Like, you have a dream, you have a thing. Doesn't matter how it comes to you, whether it's real or not. It's that you had it. You saw it. It was in a dream. You just noticed something, a piece of paper on the street that had a word on it or was a color. And then that is a seed. And then you just, you bring that to life and build on that, as opposed to doing something, having some clever idea based on someone else's idea, or just it is. I'm already getting into thinking too much, but I think it's like coming from playing with your heart.
Yeah.
Playing with your heart, writing with your heart, dancing to the music.
Man, I think that's a great place to end it.
Yeah, good.
Billy, thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh man, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.